video on multiculturalism wherein I learned that there was a what's it called, Nobel Prize winner named Samuel Bellow, and he made a controversial statement basically saying, show me the Tolstoy of the Zulus and the Proust of the Papuans and I would be happy to meet him, which many interpreted as racism because they thought he was implying that some cultures have contributed more to others, when really my opinion is that his statement was just implying that he didn't know if the Papuans and the Zulus had contributed in that way.
Who was the quote from?
Sam Bellow.
Thank you.
So yeah, and so I just heard that quote in the video, and then I was like, okay, who's Tolstoy? And then we had this class, so I was like, okay, we'll pick him. And so this quote right here I thought was pretty interesting. Everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself, and I feel like you might see that reflected in some of his life and in some of his works. And he was born in, I don't really know how to pronounce it, but Naznaya Polyana, which is kind of right outside of Russia, in 1828, and he actually ended up passing away in 1910, so since I'm a Theo major, coincidentally his lifespan kind of like is right at the same time as Ellen White's, born like a little bit after her and died just a little bit before her. So he was born into royalty, and he was the youngest of 4 boys, so he had it pretty made, like as opposed to a lot of the other people that we've kind of studied. And other than his mother's early death when he was 2 years old, he had a pretty blissful childhood. It was serene. He would, spend a lot of time like around the estate, and he would get to know some of the serfs or people who worked for his father or that big estate. And he was raised by a lot of his relatives, and kind of his childhood kind of reminded me of my own because like low-key he was kind of like homeschooled and stuff, and he just spent a lot of time reading from his father's like huge personal library, and I guess that may have influenced him later on to become a writer. And in his early adulthood, his father ended up passing away, and that caused him to go through a change in himself. He became cynical and pessimistic, and he kind of struggled with self-doubt and also doubt about religion and God and all of these different things, which is, I feel, a normal experience when you go through something traumatic, to kind of question all of these different things. He ended up moving away from the family estate to go to college, but kind of like some of us, he struggled with like the regimentation and studying and all of those different things, which I feel like was a struggle for me when I came out of homeschool, so same bro. And so he ended up dropping out of college due to depression and all of these different things that he was going through. And later on, his brother came and visited him and encouraged him to join the military, where he began writing. But before he started writing, he was in the military, and like low-key, he was like wilding a lot. Like he got into drinking, and he went to brothels a lot, and I guess came to the point where he realized that he wasn't getting much satisfaction out of all the wilding he was doing, like around his military career. And so he decided to, I guess, search for something a little better to do, and that's when he came to start writing. And so, by the way, he actually joined the military at like age 26, and he was there for I think a year or two. And he actually personally fought in the, I don't know if it's how you pronounce it, the Crimean War. And then I guess around that time during the 1850s is when he started writing, and that's when he kind of first started writing some of his works, like his semi-autobiographical trilogy, like about his early life, and also he wrote a book about his military experiences before he started writing some novels and different things that became better known. After that, he eventually got married to someone named Sophia. It's kind of cool because my sister's named Sophia. And he had 14 children, some of which are pictured here. And you can see he had this pretty radical beard, which I also thought was pretty interesting. And low-key, I thought the lady on the bottom left was the guy, but I was mistaken. Okay. And around this, I guess in the 1860s, he wrote his first great novel, War and Peace, which was kind of centered around the era where Napoleon invaded Russia, and it follows 5 aristocratic families and talks about how basically the invasion from the French kind of shifted things, either like in how the country was run, like with all the tsars and everything, and how that just kind of had an influence on the country, and just kind of follows their story. And a lot of his novels were actually like really extensive and huge. Like this one, for instance, like the War and Peace was like over 1,200 pages, and they're just like really huge works and kind of complicated and complex and all that kind of thing. And the next one, which he's also really known for, is Anna Karenina. And this one kind of focuses on like betrayal and faith and family and all of these kind of like deeper social issues. And this is also a really complex one that he wrote that had, it's like 8 parts and more than like a dozen main characters. This was also like a really huge work that was like over 850 pages, I guess depending on the translation. And then he continued to write fiction through the 1880s and 90s. And then one of his most successful works later on was the death of Ivan Ilyich, which he wrote after he had a change in life, after he was a Wilden and he kind of left that aside and started writing, and then he got married. He actually had like a religious experience and started dealing with some religion and philosophy and all that kind of thing. And so that's a little bit reflected in this work right here, which is a lot shorter. It's a novel, it's like 114 pages. But in this one, he talks about like a high court judge who ended up marrying someone that he thought was very demanding, and he wasn't really happy with her. And then he ended up just climbing the ranks of his job, and then he ends up discovering that, are we gonna end up reading this?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well,
In fact, you've already read the first half, give you a big nod.
yeah. The rest of it, you know what I'm saying? Yeah, and so anyway, then it just kind of deals with what I thought was interesting is like it kind of looks at some great controversy questions, like as it were, or my kind of spin on it. He thinks that he lived a pretty right life and everything like that, and so he starts wondering like why he has a terminal illness and is going through all of the suffering, and he feels like if he hadn't lived a right life, then it would make sense why he's going through all of this suffering. And so he's just kind of looking back at his life as he's drawing close to his death with all of these kind of questions. And but eventually, like in the end, I guess he puts his spin on what he feels like death will be like as he enters into those closing scenes. He finally finds a peace, and then the death kind of happens. And also, he wrote like extensively on like I guess some philosophy and politics, and he later influenced some really important people like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. with their nonviolent like protests and resistance to different things. We see some themes in his writings like individual choice in terms of the social and political backdrop, and the religious values that he wrote about later on in life. And in his techniques, he focused on characters or a lot of characters in many of his works, and then just kind of brought out a lot of details and kind of deeper psychological standpoints and stuff. And another interesting side note is that he was actually nominated for like a lot of Nobel Prizes and Nobel like in literature, and then a Nobel Peace Prize, which like every year from like 1902 to 1906, and then he was nominated for like the literature one like 3 or 4 times or something. But I guess he never ended up winning a Nobel Prize, which some people think is a controversy because of all of his great works and stuff. And yeah, I guess that's it.
Lights, if you please, Christian. A presentation packed with info. As always, I want you to remember what I call the broad outlines of the life. Distinguish him especially from Dostoevsky. Alan?
Yeah, I heard that he didn't have a printing machine in his day, so he had to like write all of his War and Peace was copied by hand.
Probably.
Is that true?
Well, I don't know about copied. Probably written by hand.
Okay.
There would have been, I think there were typewriters back in those days, but.
I heard his wife had to write a copy of it by candlelight. So.
This idea that he undergoes a crisis in young adulthood, I think, is interesting. So when he joins the military and his father dies, he goes off the rails and is boozing it up and going to brothels. You pointed that out, and that to me is interesting because then he kind of snaps out of it. When he leaves the military, he goes back, starts a family, goes back to that beautiful home, okay, where he had grown up, and trying to find some way to make the serf's life better. Russia was one of the last countries to give up this idea of feudalism, and I think we talked about that in connection, didn't we?
No.
One other time?
What's feudalism?
No? So basically, landowners, like his dad, would have a bunch of people living on their land, and those people weren't technically slaves, but were not exactly free either. Make sense?
Oh, okay.
A serf couldn't leave the land. A serf born on the land had to stay on the land. Was basically a forever indentured servant to the person who owned the land. Tolstoy himself, though, had a much more forward-thinking view of things and wanted to make life better for the serfs. That lifestyle, of course, all came crashing down in World War I when Russia went communist. I want you to remember the works that are up on the bullets: War and Peace, Anna Karenina, and Death of Ivan Ilyich. We'll talk about Ivan Ilyich in just a moment. These themes are really good ones. He and Dostoevsky, very interested in religious values. We can see, I think, that the Russians have not gotten burned out on religion in the same way that the French have. Make sense? So in my theories that I presented earlier, I don't think theory one has merit. I don't think that people in other countries were just as messed up as our French writers. With me there? I just think we have evidence that that's not so. The French were more messed up and disturbed than other writers were. And I think a part of that has to do with religious values. The social and political backdrop, that's really interesting to me. The psychological bit, that's a key term. Make sure you got that in your notes.
Psychological.
So he's a psychological realist. The characters come across as real people in these works of fiction.